Recording it onto this computer. I hope that's okay, Sophia. No. So this is our fourth winter lecture. We've had David Goldberg, we've had Josie Spiegel, we've had Catherine Stafford, and now we've got Melody. And yeah, maybe we'll continue. I think we're going to discuss that at our next meeting. So I just want to tell you something about Melody. Melody Buckley's been living in Limerick since 1996. She was born Melody Moskowitz and lived in Woodbourne in New York, a small town in upstate New York in the Catskill Mountains. And she lived there till she started university in '72. I've known Melody personally for about 20 years, and I've often been welcomed very, very warmly into her home. And she's been really supportive of my work. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce you to her, and you'll be able to hear about what she's been up to. And she's a member of the Munster, well, since it long ago when it was Munster Jewish Community and before that. So it's great to have members of our own community talking about their expertise. Melody's always been interested in all kinds of history, especially her own family history. And she's going to talk today about her methods for finding out information. And she's going to talk about, you know, how she can help others with their own journey. And later on, we're going to share a lot of links that will help us all. So I'm going to just ask you to stay muted. And if you've got any questions, to put them into the chat, or we'll have 10 minutes, I'd say, at the end, probably for a Q&A. So you can ask your questions then. And I'm going to spotlight you, Melody, and then you can tell me when you're ready for the slideshow.
Okay, you can start, Rudy.
Okie dokie.
Thank you. Oh, hello, everybody, and welcome to my talk on Jewish genealogy for beginners. I'm delighted to help you on your journey to finding out your family's history. I'm passionate about history, always have been, and I'm interested in my own family history and happy to help anyone else who's interested in starting on their journey. I'd like to thank the Cork Jewish community and Rudy for letting me give this talk, and I look forward to hearing anyone's questions or comments at the end. So I think that the thing is that in all introductions or beginnings begin at the beginning. Stories, memories, photos, letters, treasures, even bric-a-brac. I remember when I was very young, I found a samovar, which is a Russian tea urn that belonged to my grandmother, a very tiny one, a child's samovar, and it had pictures of the Tsar across the top of it. And I still have that, and I was always interested in its story, where it came from. And in my grandmother's stories, there are a lot of family mysteries that you hear about from your family. There are Baba Mises. I don't know, everyone knows what Baba Mise means, but it's like a tall tale. My husband says in Irish they're called pishogues, but so I'm actually going to tell you about a Baba Mise that I will tell you what it really, the story. Sometimes there's some truth to these Baba Mises, and sometimes you find out what they really mean. And so I'm going to tell you about my Baba Mise, which concerns babies and what it really was, which I discovered through research. I'm going to talk about the research process, but the major thing I'm going to talk about is the Jewish Gen organization site. And there are some other resources, but I think one of the best starting sites is the jewishgen.org site. There is also building a family tree. This is something you may want to do. And there's different ways to build a family tree, different sites for building a family tree. Some of them are free, some of them cost a little money. Visiting ancestral homes, the places where your ancestors came from. There are all sorts of places all over the world you can visit and find out after you found out information, then you can actually see the places. It's kind of interesting because compared to my husband, of course, his family's been in court probably for hundreds and hundreds of years, whereas my family's, I don't even know where they've been. I can only go as far as the late 1700s, and after that, I don't know. Graveyards, a lot of information can be gotten from graveyards. This whole new area of DNA analysis, if you have I have found new family members through Jewish Gen, through all kinds of research online, and you can also find new family members through DNA analysis. There was a big mystery with finding out my great-grandfather's family because he didn't give us his, well, it was hard to find out what his real name was, which is an interesting thing that a lot of Jewish families have. They aren't really, there are certain names that everybody seems to have, but they're not their real name. So my great-grandfather's name was Goldberg, but that wasn't his real name. It was Pachter. And through DNA analysis, we found Pachter relatives. Anyway, so next slide. So this is me on a pilgrimage, a voyage to Mikolayevo. Mikolayevo is in the center of Belarus, and it's where my grandfather, Hyman Moskowitz, was born in 1894 and lived until 1911. I was fortunate. My daughter went to Trinity, and one of her friends studied Russian literature and Russian language. And so I was able to have a companion who could speak Russian since nobody spoke English there. Apparently, Belarus is a very despotic, backwards country in some ways, but they do seem to encourage Jewish tourists. And there are a lot of Jews living there even now. So when I visited my grandfather's hometown, I was invited to meet the Jewish community in the area. And I went to a bar mitzvah, which was an incredible experience, and also met two older people who knew my grandfather's cousin who was still alive. And I will be talking about him later. But the most interesting thing is how stories, my grandfather said there was a brook or a river that went through the town of Mikolayevo, and it was a nice river, and he used to sit there and it was peaceful, and he'd fish in the river. And so I saw that river. It was the Niemen River. And when I saw it, it was violent. It was so, the currents were very, very rough, and it was spring. And my father later told me that apparently my grandfather told him a lot of people drowned in that river. It was really unsafe. But of course, I had the sanitized version of it because I was a child when I heard the story. Next slide, please. So this was the actual photograph that started me on my interest in my family's past. My grandmother, Sophie Godlin, lived in Daugavpils, which the Jews have names for all of these places in Eastern Europe and Russia, and the names are Jewish names. So she called it Dvinsk rather than Daugavpils. And this is a picture of her and my grandmother and my grandmother Sophie and her sister Rose in 1908. And what's interesting is through my research, I found out my grandmother was the older child, although she had said she was the younger child in the photo, and that my grandmother had given us a much, much younger age than her actual age. I found through research, the Jewish Gen site and another site, I found my grandmother was born in 1895. So that meant she was a lot older in this picture. But at the bottom of the picture, it says Dvinsk, and there's a date on the back and the name of the photography studio. And there's a lot of information on the Godlin family in Dvinsk. We have a historian in the family who does a lot of research. And we knew the street my grandmother lived on, and my daughter had the chance to visit Daugavpils and to go to the Jewish Museum there, and also to see the street where my grandmother lived. So my grandmother immigrated to America in 1910 and died in 1970, but I knew her until I was 15, so I heard a lot of stories. Next slide, please. So Jewish Gen, and I have up there the little the link www.jewishgen.org has the most incredible search engine, which gives you a lot of information you can find on your family name and your family history. Access is actually partially free. So $100, which will unlock many features. The search engine, which is the biggest feature or a big feature, can be unlocked for $100. You get more out of that search engine than you would get if you do it for free, but you can use some of the search engine for free. So but once you give the donation, you will never get the free search engine again. They also have first time advice for people. They have a workbook. If you make the $100 donation, you can use the workbook, and they have people who will mentor you for a fee. It's not a very large fee because you'll often be stuck. You'll be stuck finding out information about a particular person, a name. It just won't happen. I find a lot of the difficulties I have are in finding maiden names of grandmothers, of women, because obviously the men's names are more available through research than the female names through the research links. The Jewish Gen has family tree, and town finders. That's access to the search engine. And then they have Jewish discussion groups, special interest groups, a Yisker book project. Now, the Yisker books are originally, I'm going to tell you about them because I have found them very useful, but they were all probably originally written in either Hebrew or Yiddish, but some of them have been translated. And they're memorial books, and they commemorate a Jewish community destroyed by the Holocaust. And they're published by former members, and since I don't know Yiddish, I'm going to pronounce this badly, Landsmannschaft. This is a circle or society of town members from a particular town. And the Yisker Book Project Yisker books can also be found online at the New York Public Library, and there may be other libraries that have them. But like I said, a lot of them are not translated. There are projects going on the Jewish Gen site where you can work with people to help translate these books. Then there's another very useful aspect of the site, the site, and that's called Kahilla links. And they have towns, pictures, maps, etc. And anybody can participate who's from the town and add information. There's also ViewMate, where you can post they call that a tool where you can post photographs and documents online and request help in translating or identifying information. And I'll talk a little bit more about them. Next one. Thank you. Next slide, Rudy, please. So this tells you about the search engine, a little more detail. So they'll ask for the data type, and they ask for surname, a given name, a town, or any field. Now, if you don't pay the $100, you can only put one of them in. If you pay the $100, you can put all of them in, and they give you a space for that. And there's a vast amount of databases available, and each database has even smaller databases, and they cover countries and areas, most of the world, including a Sephardic database, and they're working on a new Jewish Gen Netherlands database. They don't have Antarctica. So the surname issues, that's interesting because the surnames have been translated and spelled many different ways. So you might know exactly how your ancestor's surname was spelled or how they translated it. So they have a system where you can do sounds like, or the exact name, or starts with fuzzy. And I advise always to try different spellings. So like, for example, my great-grandfather Isaac Pactor. Pactor is spelled P-A-C-T-O-R. That's how he spelled it, but it's actually also spelled P-A-K-T-E-R, P-A-K-T-O-R, and there's many permutations of that name. The unified search will tell you everything, every asset. If you put in the name, let's say Isaac Goldberg, you will get every Isaac Goldberg in every country they have, in every database they have. And the individual databases for each country are a Jewish Gen, Family Finder, some subdivisions. So, for example, the region, like Belarus has subregions, or there's a Russian Empire subdivision called a gubernia. And so, for example, Mikolayevo was in Vilna gubernia, and a lot of relatives will just say they were from Vilna, but they weren't from the city of Vilna. They were from some shtetl or little town in Vilna. So that's something you have to find out, where they actually came from, because a lot of them did not come from the city of Vilna. They came from the Vilna gubernia. Jewish Gen has research divisions, and these divisions, so let's just an example, Bessarabia gubernia. I had actually never heard of Bessarabia until I started doing research, and I have no relatives from Bessarabia. But if you do research on it, it includes Moldova, Transnistria, which is a weird breakaway state, and parts of the Ukraine. And then they have special interest groups. There's a Lithuanian one, and you can pay extra money to get information from these groups, or you can join these groups. Thank you. Kahila links. These are the web pages that provide information, databases, and links, and they cover the world. So I gave a little example here just so you'd get an idea of a special interest group from a Kahila link, the Middle East. And they have Syria, which people from Aleppo who have ancestors from Aleppo contributed, and Turkey, which was Gallipoli. But then you had Israel, and there were so many links, beginning with a town called Atlit and ending with Zikron Yaakov. So anyone with an interest in a place can create web pages about that community. Okay, so this is very interesting. How many ancestors do you have? How far back can you go? Well, if you could find your 18th great grandparents, you'd have 1 million ancestors, 1,048,576 ancestors. So I tried to see how far back I could go. That's one of the things that interests me. How far back can I go? And I got back as far as my 4th great grandparent, Aaron Shmuglarski, who lived around 1780 and came from the town of Skittle. Now, how did I find him? Well, it turns out that Jewish Gen has something called revision lists on its search engine, which come up on its search engine. And revision lists in the Russian Empire were comprehensive lists of tax-paying population. Almost all Jews had to pay. So this was the Skittle revision list. And Skittle is in Grodna gubernia, which is in Belarus. It was a Polish-speaking area. It probably belonged to Poland. A lot of these places belong to different countries over time. For example, Mikolayevo was it when my grandfather was living there. It was in the Vilna gubernia, but then it became another district called Asmiani, and I can't even pronounce what it was after World War II, or between World War I and World War II. So Aaron Shmuglarski lived about 1780. Of my 3rd great, and there were 64 of these people, which means there were 32 couples, which innumerable, many relatives are from that 4th great grandparent lineage. 3rd great grandparents, I found 3. And we're looking at about 1812, and Meyer Shmuglarski and his wife Gitladora, who was born, Meir was born in 1812. So, and you go back, and by my 2nd great grandparents of 16, I have all 16 of them. But what I don't have is the maiden names of 2 of the wives. And that's really hard to find. And I have only, but some of those people are in living memory, or their memories are remembered. So I don't have the name of Nahama Mafshevitz, who was married to Ichka, who was born in 1815, but I know that my great aunt Bessie was named after her. So it's actually a useful tradition that people are named after ancestors, because sometimes you can find them by family names. And so this is something very interesting. I don't know how much genetic material someone has when they're your 4th great grandparent, but in any event, there's my 4th great grandparent. Next slide, please. Family trees and records. So if you want to create a family tree, there are many different ways you can do it. Some of them are free and some of them cost money. And it's a matter of what you want to put in your family tree. So do you want a tree that shows cousins, aunts, uncles? How far back do you want to go? The family tree I have on Ancestry doesn't go back far enough. I can't put Aaron Shmuglarski on it. Do you want others to be able to add to your tree? So like there's a free site from ancestry.com. Now, generally that costs a lot of money, costs money to join. Ancestry Co. UK is also the English one. There's an Australian one, but basically they have charts and forms, an ancestral chart, a research calendar, a family group sheet, but you have to print them all out. You can't write them in. And then there's Jenny.com and MyHeritage.com. These are sites where you can find family trees that are already there. And you may find one that is yours, or you may find information. Now, the Ancestry, I paid for Ancestry because they gave me a deal. My sister bought me the wrong one that I didn't want, and so they felt badly about it. So they gave me a deal which was very inexpensive. So I have Ancestry now for 3 months. So I created a paid family tree there, and that's the next slide, which you can see. So this is, as you can see, my family tree that I took off of Ancestry.com. And the good thing about it is that it links to documents and photographs that are on there and to other family trees. So it's only a part of my family tree, but it shows, I can't see it close up really now, but I think it shows the Moskowitz side and my mother's family, Smuckler side. And it shows my mother's brother and my cousins. So speaking of cousins now, so this is what the Ancestry one looks like, but there are many different ways you can have trees. So next slide, please. So I found a chart off Quora, but this is the cousin story. One of the things that's interesting is cousins, the amount of DNA in cousins and what it means to have a cousin who's once removed. That's a term I hadn't really heard. Do you know who your first, second, and third cousins are? How about your first cousin once removed, or your first cousin twice removed? So like I actually knew my second cousins because my father was an only child and my mother only had 2 cousins. And I grew up in a town, my great-grandparents were the first Jews to move into my town. And so all of the family lived in that town. My father grew up in the town, and I had I had great uncles and a great aunt. I had family that lived there. So I knew my second cousins. So for first cousins once removed, you share a great grandparent. And your uncle, aunt's grandchild, you share a common grandparent. And twice removed, your grandparent's first cousin, you share a great grandparent. or your uncle, aunt's great-grandchild, you share a common grandparent. Now, first cousins share about 12.5% DNA, and second cousins share great-grandparents 3.1.25% DNA. Third cousins share less DNA, and fourth and fifth cousins, the outer limits for DNA sharing share even less. Now, when my parents did their DNA with 23andMe, they turned out to be fourth or fifth cousins. But that isn't always real. There's something called endogamy, which Ashkenazic Jews have, where it may not really be the case. It's a long story, which I'm not going to talk about now, but basically it's not clear whether they're really related or not. However, I've spent a lot of time trying to track down a link in about the third or fourth generation of grandparents to see if they really are related, since my grandparents, my families come from a very close area and they don't come from a very distant area. So it's quite possible there is a link somewhere that I could find. Next page, please. Thank you. So this was the chart, which is so nicely done. You could just have a look at it. And if anyone wants to get a hold of this chart afterwards, as you can see, your first cousin once removed is the child of your granduncle or grand aunt, and you share a grandparent, and they have second cousin, and they even have third cousin twice removed, which is quite a distance. But I think up through third cousins, there is some DNA sharing, but it's very limited. Next one, please. So, learning from headstones. So there's a lot you can learn from headstones. And I started out on this through my own journey. My bubby, Sarah Goldberg, who was originally probably Pachter, told me a terribly sad story how her beautiful redheaded sister died of TB, and she was 16 years old, and her name was Ida. So after I did a lot of research, I was able to find Ida Goldberg's gravestone. Ida was born in 1894 and died she was born in 1894 in Philadelphia and died in 1910. She was buried in Har Yehuda Cemetery in Upper Darby, Pennsylvania. How did I find that? Well, there's a site called findagrave.com. And findagrave.com will help you find graves. Now, they are in the UK and they're in the US. They may be in other countries. I think they're starting in Ireland. Volunteers who agree to take photographs of graves for you so you can have the gravestone. And you can put a little memory, like a little flower or something. And there's also, Jewish Gen has $1 billion graves too, which gives you information. And then there's other information on graves on that site. But in any event, if you want a translation, you can get it through ViewMate on Jewish Gen, or I have actually, there are Facebook groups you can get translations. There are a lot of different ways you can get a translation because these graves are either in Hebrew or Yiddish. But you might want to find the name of the father on that grave. Unfortunately, they don't usually give the names of the mother's maiden name or anything. In fact, what they'll have is something, the name of the woman and then the name of her father. And there are symbols. So my great-grandfather, David Isaac Godlin, was a Kohen. And his grave has a picture of two hands, a hand on one side and a hand on the other. And that's the symbol of a Kohen. There are symbols for various status. And there are poems and all kinds of epitaphs, information you can find on the grave. And so it's a good thing to make use of the ViewMate and also find a grave. My family story was confirmed by Find a Grave, but I also found a lot of information. I found the date of death, the death certs, etc., of Ida Goldberg. However, when you look at date of death and death certs, sometimes you can only get indexes and sometimes you get the actual document. In Philadelphia, they go up to 1915, providing the actual death certificate. So I know this poor child died in her home in February 1915. It's 10 of tuberculosis, of consumption. There's also free family search and something called free BMD Co UK for English information, but it's an index, which means you may have to order the cert from the archives. There's also Ancestry and Find My Past. So you can get all this information about the death and then find the grave. And that gives you a lot of information to help you know the person's date of death, who their father was, and sometimes other information as well. Next, please. I just wanted to briefly touch on Holocaust research. There are testimonies about survivors and family. And that's through Yad Vashem. And the reason I was interested in this was for a variety, two reasons. One I will mention later in a few minutes, but also because I was trying to find information for a hidden child who asked me about looking for information. There's Jewish Gen Yisker books and databases, the New York Public Library Yisker books, and survivor testimonies at the British Library and the Smithsonian. So these are interesting pieces of information. Next, please. So my personal Holocaust research concerned my cousin, Alan Smulovich Small. Alan was my grandfather's cousin, my father's cousin. His father was my grandfather's father's brother. And he was born in 1928. And he was born in Mikolayevo, but wound up in Evia, which is a town nearby. He was the youngest partisan fighter. And so when I found out about him and realized he was related to me, I did all this research on partisans, and all the Jews in the community in Belarus knew about him because he had been one of the partisan fighters there. And he survived. And my father remembers him when they were young, like about 18 or so. And he told my father he wanted to kill every German he ever saw and all sides. So he was very angry. And eventually he settled in America and he had a very happy life, and he's still alive. And he gave me a lot of help and information about my trip to Belarus. So next. So what about the baby? Fact or fiction? Well, this was a story that was delightfully told to me by the Smuckler family, my grandfather, Hyman Smuckler, my mother's father, and all of the Smukklers who I met my grandfather's, some of my grandfather's brothers when I was growing up. So the Shmuklarskis were originally Shmuklarskis, but first they changed their name to Shmukler, and then they changed it to Smuckler. So there are many different versions of Smuckler, but they are originally the Shmuglarskis or Smuglarskis. And if you look on Jewish Gen, Smuglarski is often spelled Symuklerski. So it has different, it can have a Polish spelling or a Lithuanian spelling. There's different ways of spelling it. So my great grandmother, who I was named after, had 8 boys that survived. And when they immigrated to Philadelphia from Bialystok, Poland, which was is Belarus now was Belarus in 1904, they had about 6 boys at that time and 1 set of boy twins who were 2 years old. The legend was they also smuggled in a baby who grew up to be the infamous American gangster Meyer Lansky. Now, that kind of could be true because Meyer Lansky was a baby at the time. He was born, Meyer Suchov Lansky, in 1902 in Grodno. And like, it could be Grodno Gubernia, or it could be the city of Grodno. There's a city of Grodno that's like about 20 miles from Bialystok, between Bialystok and Skittle. And my great grandmother was working in a cigarette factory in Grodno when they eventually immigrated. And the way they immigrated was there was a scheme where a very rich American Jewish person helped people by giving them loans through family members in Philadelphia. So my great-grandmother's father, Isaac Kaplan, who was born about 1840, had previously immigrated to Philadelphia, and he and maybe another relative helped fund my smuggler relatives, my smuggler grandparents, through the Blitzstein Bank, which gave them loans. So did they smuggle in Meyer Lansky? Everyone talked about this was the biggest thing that they smuggled him in. And they were actually proud of it because they were slightly, they were dodgy themselves. They were horse thieves in the old country, or smugglers. They smuggled horses over the Polish border, and they subsequently had a stable when they came to Philadelphia. So it was quite possible that since my great-grandfather was a teamster and was of an element that did horse smuggling, that they could have had Meyer Lansky brought him. It turned out they didn't. From Ancestry.com and Family Search, I found out that there was this bank passage order book, and you can find out what actually happened on the book records when they left Russia or Bialystok to come to America. And there's they only give you number of, a code, and you have to look on the Temple University ticket purchase ledgers to get the actual information. And the information was that the twins, they tried to smuggle the twins in for free, but the twins were 2 years old. They were not 6 months old. And so they lied about their ages, and they lied about the twins. The twins were probably walking and talking. And even though they tried to swaddle them and make them look like babies, they didn't fool the people who were, in charge of immigration. And so they had to pay the fare for the babies because they had to pay a child's fare. And they were probably very unhappy about that. And subsequently, they came to America, and so the babies were not Meyer Lansky, but the two twins who were not babies. But then they had a baby after they came to America, and they named him Meyer. And he died about 3 months after he was born. So this could be all confusion and story, but like, it was sort of true that they did have a baby they brought in, or they were trying to smuggle in their own babies, really. So that's basically my talk, except we're going to look at the last two now, which are the search engines. And we have Rosenblatt at Jewish Roots. Anybody who wants to research their Irish Jewish roots. There are a lot of sites that I didn't include on this. These are just the basic sites. The Family Search site is free. It's a Mormon site. For some reason, the Mormons want this information for religious reasons. I think the Mormons also run Ancestry.com too. FindMyPastCode.uk now has the 1921 UK there's a 1921 UK census and a 1936 UK census, and I think these censuses are either close to, I think you can get one, the 1936 one or 1939 one. These are censuses for UK. MyHeritage.com and Genie.com, and then there's a French one, Philae.com, where you can get French. The Dutch have many, many sites where you can get their information. I actually wanted Dutch information because the Pactors had a Dutch side. Anyway, so the next one my last one. Okay, there are a lot of Facebook groups and they're really good. I belong to several of them and I have gotten information since all of my relatives, or most of my relatives, the Lithuania and Latvia Jewish genealogy applies. I joined that one. The Belarus one has Jews and non-Jews, and I belong to the Jewish London genealogy and research because there are a lot of actors in London. So these are the ones I have found, and it is definitely not inclusive, but you may be interested in them. There are other Sephardic sites too. Some of the sites that are on Jewish Gen are also separate sites. There's a site for people who, another site which is on Facebook and also online, is a site for Ellis Island and for immigration. Unfortunately, there are no sites for that I could find for immigration that are very, well, I haven't found very good information for people who immigrated from, let's say, Lithuania or Russia to England. I don't know why it's difficult. They may have some information, but most of the information is people going to America, people going to South America, to other countries. So that's my talk for now. I mean, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. Thank you so much, all of you, for listening. And thank you again, Rudy, for everything.
I think we can unmute and say thank you very much to Melody. I mean, you've obviously done a lot of research into your family, and you've put it together really nicely for us. And these links, I'm actually going to try and share the links in a PDF in the chat, but you can also get them by looking at our website in a few days' time, hopefully, Cork Jewish Community, or maybe if you email info@corkjewishcommunity.ie, we can send you on the list of links, because it's great to have them all in one place. So thank you so much for putting that together. And I think, you've given me ideas and impetus to, follow up some questions that, might have had.
I'd like to make everyone feel enthusiastic about their own history and digging up things and looking through old photographs and talking to older people about their stories.
That's a tall story. Asking people now, the majority of the Irish Jewish community are elderly. And once they've gone, the library is gone. And the younger generation leave it too late, like myself. Whereas only after my parents died that I decided to look for my family. 25 years later, I'm still trying to find my elusive grandmother. So what chance of it? On the other hand, anybody who wishes to look for their Irish Jewish ancestry, I would be able to help them out. We've only got 70,000 records, so we'll try for another 10 in the meantime. But I must thank you, Melody, for that wonderful, interesting talk. It's very, very involved, much more involved than anybody else would ever consider, especially for all the various sites. But I think at the end of the day, you really have to start off with yourself, and the information about you and your brothers and sisters and who they married, that is equally as important as going back 150 years, because tomorrow we're gone and that's the end of the story. So your grandchildren won't know who you are because we've gone blinkered all the way down. You need your grandmother, what's her sister's maiden name before she got married, and what about her brothers and sisters? They all and their extended family. Anyway, that's me, but I do thank you very much. I don't know 90% of the people who are on this Zoom, I have no idea who you are, but maybe it's about time I got to know you. And maybe one day I'll be asked very kindly to give a word or two to you on how to search for your Irish connections to there. But Melody has done a brilliant work, and the amount of research and time that she's given is more time than anybody would have. Well done, and thank you.
I just wanted to add a word of caution because Melody mentioned the Mormons, but there's issues with the Mormons in that they baptize their ancestors in reverse. So people who've died can be baptized according to the Mormon tradition. And there has been a lawsuit because they used the records from Yad Vashem to baptize the Jewish people who had died in the Holocaust, in the Shoah, retroactively. So they have a particular interest in converting Jewish people. So they have these records readily available. That's the reason why they have it. It's because they've retroactively converted and baptized people who've died. They had to take all the Yad Vashem people out of their books. By the way, they weren't allowed to. So that's a bit of an iffy background, just of interest.
Okay.
I heard that actually.
Just as a matter of interest, when you go on the various sites and they always ask you to add in your family details, they then go online for public access. Also, oh, that's one point. The other, they can go on public access. You can also limit it, but one of the defects is that you can't print your family tree. So if you're going to go onto one of these family tree sites, try and make sure that you can print what you have written on your tree, because there's no use having 500 people there and you have no hard copy.
That's why I suggested, by the way, that I paid for 3 months of Ancestry and I printed it out already. And if you get the free one, you have to print it out, the blank form, and copy it in.
Yes, the family tree maker, you can put it into that sort of documentation, and then you can various ways you can draw it out. I also use family. I don't use it very much, but I've only got a couple of thousand personal records in there. But most of the time I'm on ancestry.com, and I find them very, very helpful. But again, you have to subscribe to it. But you're better off subscribing to one that you can get information from. And don't forget, I'm not doing one person, I'm doing everybody's tree. Thousands, hundreds of people every day. Anyway, sorry, taking away from what you're doing. Brilliant job.
Melody, I think that was really interesting and really inspiring. And I'm still confused about the first and the second cousins and the removed that, but I'm slightly less confused than I was. So thank you.
You can look at it, the little chart on the form, and it'll help, I think.
That was very helpful.
Melody, is it all right with you if we share other bits of your PowerPoint presentation as well as those links at the end if people are interested in getting that chart? Or
I think that would be great, but I think the thing about the that chart on the cousins is I got it from Quora, so maybe you have to say where it came from before people get it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess if anyone wants it, yeah, you can find it on Quora.
Or they can have it as long as they know that's where it came from, you know.
Marion, where's she gone? Are there any other thoughts or questions? I would like to hear it all again, so I'm going to enjoy watching the recording because I've been so busy trying to juggle computers and stuff. I'm going to enjoy watching the recording a bit later this evening and taking it all in. It's absolutely fascinating hearing people's stories, and of course, if there is anyone on the call with any Cork connections, you know, who to talk to, I'm always interested to hear about Cork connections. So if there is anyone on the call, please do get in touch with me through the Cork Jewish community.
I thought I had a Cork connection because I had a Goldberg ancestor, but it turns out the name wasn't Goldberg, it was Pachter.
Yeah, because there was actually Sarah Goldberg on your list, your family tree there somewhere, wasn't there?
Well, her father's real name was Pachter, and he was a kind of dodgy character too. He was escaping from radical politics from Lithuania when he came from I think a place called Viduklia in Lithuania, and Kelmi Vidukli it was called.
Well, if you want to contact me, we see what we can find for you.
I don't think that they were in Ireland. I had originally thought there was some sort of strange thing that I wound up in Ireland and that I had ancestors here, but that is actually not true.
Well, if anybody has one, they can either contact you, contact Ruthie, or if they wish to, by all means, a pleasure to contact me. I'm going to have to say good night to you. It's been wonderful meeting you all, and I wish you well in your endeavors in trying to trace your family.
Thanks, Stuart. It's absolutely great to see you. Thanks so much for coming. And thank you, everyone. Thanks, Melody. I'll stop the recording now, actually.